My name is Doug Jackson Smith. I'm a professor at Ohio State University, and I'll be talking today about a paper and a research project that's exploring the relationship between land tenure and conservation. And this work was done with colleagues at Utah State University and two nonprofit organizations that focus on farmland preservation. While the title of our original submission was What's in the Suitcase, we've updated our title to really focus in on the important role that social ties and connection to land and community play in perhaps mediating the relationships between agricultural conservation and land tenure. As a little bit of background, most of the United States has quite a bit of the land that is farmed, which is operated by someone other than the owner of that land. On this map, we can see areas in dark blue that reflect situations in which more than half of farmland is operated by a renter. And these are often in some of the most agriculturally important and productive areas of the United States. The issue of land tenure is not a new issue when it comes to thinking about natural resource management. Indeed, there's a long history of research about the importance of having secure tenure and property right arrangements in order to effect effective long-term and sustainable natural resource management in both agriculture and beyond. And generally speaking, the work in agriculture has presumed that land ownership and secure property rights are important to incentivizing people to make investments in conservation on farmland. Interestingly, though, there's quite a bit of variability in the research literature. Linda Procopi and her team recently published a major review of agricultural conservation behavior research and found that inclusion of a flag for "is the land rented" had largely unexpected and inconsistent results, with more than the vast majority of the studies not finding a significant relationship, and more studies finding a positive relationship, which was unexpected, than found a negative relationship. At the same time, there's been quite a bit of recent research that focuses on characteristics of the landowner and the role that farm characteristics like farm size play in helping us understand where and under what circumstances conservation may be more likely. In addition, people have looked at the decision-making relationships between owners and renters and the important role that different conservation practice characteristics may play in shaping the likelihood of adoption. In particular, situations in which structural investments with long-term returns environmentally, like no-till production practices, and being less likely to be adopted on rented land than on owned land. So our focus, as I said at the outset, is to explore the role of social and community ties and the possibility that understanding the relationships people have to their renter and have to their land and community can help us better understand the likelihood and the patterns of conservation behavior. As theoretical background, we look to economic sociology, the work of Carl Polanyi and Mark Granovetter, who have really been pioneers in underscoring the important role of social institutions and social relationships in fundamental economic behavior, like relationships between landlords and renters. We also look to the sociology of agriculture, which has underscored the importance of family ties and family relationships in helping us understand farm decision-making, in particular ways in which land is managed with an eye towards the future. And finally, we look to community sociology, which has focused less in agriculture, but certainly a great body of work that underscores how strong community ties can influence the likelihood of engaging in pro-environmental behavior. Now, interestingly, the expectations from looking at this literature as a whole for what social ties might mean for the management of rented land are not 100% clear. Generally speaking, we would expect people who have personal relationships to their renters might be less likely to make waves, or if they live in communities that are not widely embracing conservation, strong attachment to the community could be a barrier to engaging in conservation land. On the other hand, those with family ties and strong connections and emotional attachments to an area may be more invested in long-term outcomes and sustainability, and that can drive more conservation practices. Data for our study comes from the American Farmland Trust's non-operator landowner survey, a survey that was conducted across 11 states in 2018 and 2019 that focused on non-operating landowners with roughly equal proportions of male and female landowners in each of those study states. The study produced a sample of roughly 3,600 respondents, about 300 in each state, with response rates ranging from 8 to 40, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. Dependent variables included in that survey were indicators of participation in conservation programs and the enrollment of the largest parcel of land that they lease out in one of these three kinds of conservation programs listed here. It also asked whether or not conservation practices were included in lease arrangements that were used by the renter, and whether or not specific practices like cover crops, conservation tillage, nutrient management, or any and all of these were measures that we're using today. Give you a feel for the distribution of those dependent variables. Roughly 20% of landowners reported enrolling their parcels in at least one of those three conservation programs, and about half had at least one kind of conservation practice as a stipulation in their lease. Measures of social ties included the relationship that the landlord has to their renter, whether they're family, a friend of the family, or something else, the number of years they've leased to their current renter, whether or not their lease is written versus verbal, and the number of years they've owned that parcel, if it's an inherited parcel, and how frequently they visit the parcel that's rented out. Finally, we had questions about whether or not the landowner considers different factors when making decisions about that parcel. And answers included, or considerations included, paying attention to the needs of the operator or the renter, the interests of neighboring landowners and the broader community, as well as the needs of future generations, particularly in their family. Give you a feel for how these social ties manifest in a sample like this. Roughly a quarter of the respondents were non-operating landowners who rented to a family member, 44% rented to a friend of the family, and only about 30% rent to somebody who's neither a relative or a friend of the family. About 65% inherited the parcels they lease out, and about a little under half had a written lease. Interestingly, about a third of the non-operating landowners in this study live on the land of the parcel that they lease out, and another quarter visit or are on that parcel at least once a week or monthly, with the remainder visiting that parcel on a less frequent basis. As control variables, we're using indicators of things that have been shown to be important in understanding conservation behavior in the past, including the age, gender, education, farm experience of the non-operating landowner, as well as their reliance on farmland income, leasing income as a source of household income. The size of the parcel, the use of the parcel, and who's the primary decision maker, as well as a dummy variable for every state in the study. We use binary logistic regression models, which are models that help predict the effect of particularly key variables on the likelihood of a yes, no, or bivariate outcome, net the effect of other things in the model. Very quickly, the control variables were often significant in these models with relationships that are generally consistent with previous research. Younger people are more likely to engage in conservation. Female non-operating landowners are less likely, and those who lease larger amounts and have a farm background were slightly more likely to engage in conservation programs or include conservation language in their leases. But jumping to the social ties, the results of social tie variables were often significant and had interesting patterns in terms of the direction of that relationship. On this table, we show the strength and the direction of the relationships for predictors of whether or not that parcel involved participation in cost share conservation programs, receiving conservation technical assistance, or whether the landlord had updated or developed a conservation plan for that parcel. What you can see is that the relationship to the renter had no effect on the propensity to enroll in programs, whereas the lease length was a disincentive to development of a conservation plan. In other words, those who've rented for longer periods of time to the same renter were a little bit less likely to have developed a conservation parcel or plan for that lease. On the other hand, the presence of a written lease agreement was very positively related to participation in cost share programs and getting conservation technical assistance. The most important driver, however, seems to be visitation patterns. Those who live on or visit most frequently were much more likely to have conservation programs or participate in conservation programs. There were weak relationships between the likelihood of being in programs and whether you inherited your land. In other words, those with inherited land were somewhat less likely to participate in cost share or get technical assistance, but these did not reach the 0.05 level of significance. And finally, those who are attentive or sensitive to the needs of neighboring landowners and the surrounding community, as well as future generations of farming, appeared to be more likely to have enrolled their leased land in conservation programs. When we looked at the inclusion of language about the use of conservation practices and leases, we find that those who leased to family members were actually more likely to have stipulated that conservation tillage or nutrient management be done on those parcels. Those who've leased for longer periods of time as well were modestly more likely to include conservation tillage and nutrient management requirements. And written leases were more likely to have at least one of these included in there. The households that had owned land for longer periods of time were more likely to have this in their leases. However, those who have inherited their land were less likely to include language about conservation practices. Again, one of the most significant variables and positively related to conservation was the frequency with which the non-operating landowner visits or lives on that land, with those who are most resident being more inclined to include that language. And those who reflect a higher priority for paying attention to neighboring landowners and having stronger relationships with their community are also more likely to have adopted most of those practices. Can I give you the highlight conclusions? In terms of relationships to renters, net the effect of all the control variables. If that renter is a family member, the results, at least of our analysis, suggest that they're more likely to have conservation practice language in the lease. A result that we found to be surprising because it seemed to be a situation in which stipulating things might be less likely to occur. On the other hand, those who've rented to the same person for a long time were less likely to have a conservation plan, which we see as being not surprising, given that there hasn't been an opportunity to turn that property over and that those relationships seem to be fairly stable. On the other hand, having a long-term relationship had a weak but positive relationship with including conservation practices in leases. Finally, one of the most consistent results is that written leases with tenants are associated with increased use of conservation behaviors, both enrollment in conservation programs and including conservation language in leases. In terms of family ties to the land, inheriting the land was associated with a decreased likelihood of using conservation. Other qualitative work that our team has done with landowners, non-operating landowners, suggests that what often happens with inherited land is that you have multiple siblings, all of whom have to be involved in decision-making, and that can discourage the use of things like developing conservation lease language or enrolling land in conservation programs. However, non-operating landowners who report that they do consider future generations of their family when making land decisions were more likely to put their land in conservation programs or to have cover crops mentioned in leases. And finally, non-operating landowners who live on or visit their rented parcels more frequently were much more likely to include conservation in their leases or participate in programs, and those who say that they pay attention or are sensitive to the needs of neighbors and communities were more likely to do conservation. So overall, our research shows that social ties can mediate conservation behavior on rented farmland. Researchers should probably account for these social ties in future surveys and statistical models. And extension and outreach programs would do well to be attentive to the importance of social relationships as potential mediators of the likelihood of conservation. From a policy perspective, two of the results we think are important. One is that less than half of these leases are written at present, but having a written lease is usually a sign that people are paying attention to the details of how that land is being managed and was quite positively associated with conservation on rented land. And finally, the issue of visitation and absentee ownership seems to rise as another major driver. Clearly, those who live on the land and have a strong relationship to that land or visit and know that area best are more likely to do conservation than those who are absentee are less likely. And that factors in often to state and local policies about conservation. And my time is up. And potentially could inform the desirability of putting restrictions on absentee ownership or investor in farming. So with that, we'll open us up to questions, and I'll stop my recording, and I look forward to seeing all of you at the live question and answer.